Good morning and welcome to Crop Hour. I believe we're on week 10. This week we are going to cover forage production. I'll be your host, Sarah Bowder. I'm our forage field specialist with SDSU Extension based out of a Mitchell Regional Center. And today we are going to hear from Patrick Wagner. He is one of our entomology field specialists, and he is based out west in the Rapid City area. And Patrick is going to cover insect pests. So he's going to talk about alfalfa insect pests and blister beetles today, which have been popular topics. They're always popular topics, but the last couple years we've had a lot of questions specifically on blister beetles too. So I think many of you will enjoy learning some more about this topic. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. There is a Q&A option down at the bottom of your screen and also the chat. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. If you have trouble with that, we can get them through the chat feature as well. And if you're looking for CCA credits, at the very end of Patrick's talk today, we will show a QR code. So have your app ready and you can scan that to get credits. Otherwise, if you have any other issues throughout the webinar, you can just send us a chat and we'll be happy to try to help you out. So Patrick has quite a bit of research and background in dealing with forage pests, and I know he's answered a myriad of questions that we've worked together on the last couple of years. So he's a great resource on this topic. And without further ado, Pat, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction, Sarah. Yeah, so today's it's kind of a couple different topics merged together, I guess. The first portion of my talk, I'm going to focus on just alfalfa insect pests in general, the different pests that will commonly affect alfalfa production here in South Dakota. And then the second half is really going to be all about blister beetles. We'll talk about the different types of blister beetles that we see and kind of some of our scouting and management tactics, why they're important, that kind of thing. So starting off, like I said, I'll just go through several of these just general insect pests here of alfalfa. And one that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with is, of course, the alfalfa weevil. So this one, as you can see, the larval stage is the most damaging with this pest here. So we have these little tiny green worms, basically, that you'll see on the plants. They're super small. And then the adult stage here on the left side of the screen is that's the adult weevils. So they have these kind of long snouts on them. They're going to be light brown and then have that dark stripe down the back. So with alfalfa weevils, you'll have them affecting the first cutting, right off the bat, and then any regrowth after that. I'll talk a little bit about that here when we get into management. But then with the larva, they'll feed on just the growing points of the plants. So any of the new leaves will start from the top down, basically. And that damage is going to look like those just little circular holes there on the leaves. So scouting, like I said, it's going to start. They're going to start impacting the alfalfa there in, but prior to the first cutting. So right away in May, you need to be looking for these guys. The threshold is 2 larvae per stem, but basically, if you're seeing any larvae out there, there's probably it's a good idea to do some type of management, because it really happens quickly with alfalfa weevils that they can really cause some damage in a short amount of time. The other thing is if 30 to 40% of those leaf tips are damaged, that's kind of our defoliation threshold, which I'll talk about that a little bit later as well with some of these other pests, but that's kind of our general defoliation threshold for alfalfa. Okay, so how can we manage alfalfa weevils? Well, one is doing an early harvest before those thresholds are reached. If the alfalfa weevils got going, late enough that we can do an early harvest before a lot of that damage occurs. If they do reach those threshold levels, you need to do some type of treatment, you can spray a foliar insecticide. However, alfalfa is a flowering crop, so beware of that toxicity to bees. Try to do any insecticide applications later in the day, late afternoon or evening when those bees, the activity is really dying down. So you're not going to have as many, those non-target impacts of some type of foliar spray. Now, like I was saying, uh, with doing like an early harvest or something, if you have a lot of those weevils still in the field, they will feed on the regrowth. So that's going to cause stunting for your second cutting. So in order to kind of combat that, yeah, if you don't do an insecticide spray, if you have a lot of them showing up in the field, you don't do a spray before that first cutting, it's a good idea to then spray the stubble, because otherwise you're just not going to get any regrowth off of that. That second cutting is just going to be really stunted and not going to want to grow back. So that's just something to take into consideration. I've also included a couple, alternative methods. This is some cultural control that, I've heard some success with it. There's not a ton of research here that backs these things up, but it's some practices that have been, tried by different producers here for a while. But one is doing some type of spring cultivation. There's some pros and cons to this. So yeah, you'd be using like a spring tooth harrow or a disc. And the idea is that you're going to be doing this before that alfalfa starts to green up at all. So, I mean, really, any time here in, your late winter, really early spring is when you'd be doing that. And you're kind of breaking up the crowns or trying to activate those. So you're basically getting those plants to start growing a lot earlier, so that you can get that initial cutting of the alfalfa before these guys show up. The downside to this is, you can have some disease issues if you're breaking up those crowns. If you do it later, when it's starting to green up, that can cause some issues that you can have, open them up for disease. But if you do it early enough, you should be clear that way. The other thing is doing like fall grazing, especially with sheep. They really will actually seek out those overwintering weevils that are there at the base of the plants. So they can do that. Otherwise, you'll kind of get some trampling action too. Any type of way to like disrupt or disturb their overwintering sites there at the base of the plant. So that's another kind of cultural control option you can try as well. But otherwise, those insecticides are going to be our main method for management. The next one I'll talk about is the potato leafhopper. So this is a migratory insect. They come up from the southern US each year. And really that migration is, it's limited. It limits them to, usually we don't see them till the second cutting. Although I'd say like last year, if we get a quick warm up in the spring or some really strong south winds, it can bring these guys up a little bit earlier in the season, and they can affect the first cutting. But it's kind of rare. Like last year, we did have some spots on the southern end of the state where these guys were showing up early. We have had pretty warm temperatures already this spring, so it might be something to watch for sooner rather than later with this insect. So the adults and the nymphs, they kind of have this little, green bullet-shaped body, super tiny. That's one there on an alfalfa leaf. But the adults and nymphs can both cause that damage. And this is what it looks like. We refer to this injury as hopper burn. You'll have these yellowing tips of the leaves and kind of really all over the place there that it looks like they're almost drought stressed. And there's kind of another close up of what that looks like. So the leaf hoppers, they feed on that plant xylem. Like I said, it's often mistaken for drought stress, but it's actually that hopper burn. And then the results that can, end up with kind of a lower yield or quality of that crop, and then it can stunt the plants as well. So for leafhopper management, it really depends there on how, what stage in growth that the alfalfa is, and then obviously how many of those leafhoppers that are showing up. So we do have some tables on our website. That's at the bottom there, that extension.sdstate.edu. If you just do a quick search of potato leafhoppers, you'll find one of our previous articles there that should have these tables on there, and you can kind of base it off of, 0 to 4 inches. If they're 4 to 8 inches or up to 12 inches tall, it will, that threshold for how many leafhoppers those plants can tolerate will depend. And then it also takes into account the value of the hay, and then the cost per acre of an insecticide. So again, that scouting, it's going to depend the thresholds, but in general, if you use, these are based on 25 sweeps with a sweep net. We'll talk about that even more, because there's a lot of these pests that you can use a sweep net just to figure out, how many are there, and it's an excellent scouting tool. So in terms of management, you want to try to reduce that buildup of the leafhoppers. You can do an early harvest there in the bud stage to try to reduce the numbers, and then also, you can apply an insecticide there if needed, based on those threshold tables. So the next one I want to talk about is aphids. So these guys, they're kind of, several different aphids that will affect alfalfa. We have pea aphids. These ones show up more, of those cool, wet conditions. I know we had a lot of issues with them back in 2019. Seemed like that was a pretty cool, wet year and perfect for pea aphids. But we have several other aphids that can show up as well. The spotted alfalfa aphid, there's the blue aphid, and then the cowpea aphids. So with the pea aphid, again, this one's the largest of those aphids, and it's more the one that we have the most issues with. Again, you have to have those cool, wet conditions for these populations to really take off, but they're really good size. Yeah, up to 1/4 of an inch long, so really easy to see with the naked eye. The presence, they can have leave a golden hue on the field if you're looking out at an alfalfa field that's got a pretty heavy infestation of pea aphids. And then that feeding, they're going to be feeding on the plant juices there, and reduce the yields. So management with these, again, the alfalfa can tolerate those low populations, but it's when they get really, when you get a lot of these ramping up, those populations can grow quickly and cause some problems. Again, you can do an early harvest and an insecticide application. We have kind of a table for these as well, based on, again, those sweep nets, or you can count these guys on the stems of the plants. It's a lot easier using a sweep net, in my opinion, but yeah, you can kind of base it off of the growth stage, if it's worth treating that infested field, or just cutting it, and maybe that's just a better option too if they're not too bad. Next is plant bugs. So in an alfalfa field, you might see all three of these: the meadow plant bug, the lygus bug, and the alfalfa plant bug. The meadow plant bug is really only going to show up where you have more of a grass alfalfa hay mix. They are generally not considered to be a significant pest. It's the lygus bugs and alfalfa plant bugs that are more of an issue. Here's what the nymphal stages look like. So before, this was the adult stages. The top one there is the alfalfa plant bug with the spotted legs like that. And then that really kind of interesting, colorful one is the lygus bug there on the bottom. But these guys, they'll feed on the growing points. You'll usually see them up at the top of the plants, and that injury can cause, again, the stunting and reduce forage quality. And these guys, they typically ramp up around early to mid-June is when I start seeing a lot of them. May might be a little early, but on a year like this, if we have an early spring, we might need to be out there scouting a little earlier than we usually do. So for plant bug management, you want to do an early harvest again before those adults are present. If you can harvest when there's a lot of nymphs, those nymphs really require a lot more, or are they're less tolerant, when they have to have a food source readily available all the time. So if you do that cutting and there's just some stubble left behind, that can really drop your numbers with those. There are some thresholds here for doing some insecticide application. For lygus bugs, it's 40 bugs per 10 sweeps, and then the plant bugs is 30 bugs per 10 sweeps. And you can see that's actually myself and Adam Varenhorst out there in a alfalfa field running a sweep net. And you can see that that's, doing those pendulum sweeps, you're going back and forth across the body once. So just like the pendulum of like a grandfather clock, that you're going back across the body and then back, that's considered one pendulum sweep. And if you just kind of keep walking forward in a straight line there, that's pretty ideal there for getting a good measurement. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is grasshoppers. And this is one that is always an issue every year. The nymphs and the adults, we're very familiar with these, that they'll feed on the leaves. And as you get later in the season, you'll have more of those adults showing up. And that can really cause some problems because they have a bigger appetite and can cause a lot more defoliation a lot faster. So they are a bigger threat when you have drought conditions. Sometimes they'll start out in the road ditches or more in like pastures, and then they'll move into your alfalfa fields and then other crops once things start to dry down and they're looking for any type of green vegetation. So for management with these, the economic threshold is 8 to 10 adults per square yard, or 15 to 20 nymphs per square yard. And when you are scouting for these, you can do visual counts. So you can just kind of picture a 1 square yard in your mind and walk toward that spot and count the number of grasshoppers that jump out of that spot. Or you can do, again, with a sweep net, excellent tool, 4 pendulum swings. That kind of equates to that 1 square yard. And you can do your scouting that way as well. This diagram here kind of shows an options for doing this type of scouting. So there can be an edge effect with grasshoppers. So you want to make sure that you go quite a ways into the field and kind of making this little sort of horseshoe pattern, doing make sure those are the 50 feet apart between those squares, or where you're doing those pendulum swings. So you can kind of sample these different patches throughout the field. So you might only need to do, if you have to spray for grasshoppers, it might just be like something along the border. You might not have to treat the entire field because you could get some of those really close to the fence line a lot more. And then as you get further into the field, it's not so bad. But that diagram is just kind of an option that you can follow. So for grasshoppers, we can do some preventative treatments. You can use fungal or poison baits. There's a couple options there. You can use the ones that are the poison baits are, I think it's typically carbaryl that's the active ingredient of those. That any of those baits, it's like bran flakes or like pellets that they use, and they'll either have an insecticide on them, so the grasshoppers will eat them or consume those pellets and then get poisoned by the insecticide. Or you can do, if you can find some fungal baits, there's something called Nolo bait that I know the company that produces that, they had some production issues the last couple years, so they haven't been making it so much. But it sounds like they might have it available this year. Again, if you want to get the baits, it's a good idea to try to purchase those early, because they usually do sell out by mid to late July, when everybody's needing them. You can't usually get those things anymore. The other thing is spraying an insect growth regulator. So that's used to kill the nymphs. So as we can see here, there's a nymphal stage of a grasshopper, doesn't have those wings fully developed. If you can treat them when they're in those, first through maybe third instar is excellent, because that insect growth regulator, it's very target specific, and it's going to prevent those grasshoppers from being able to molt to get into that adult stage. So again, it's something that you'll use early on to combat the nymphs. If you have a lot of adult grasshoppers showing up, an insect growth regulator is really pointless to spray at that point because they're already fully grown. If you are spraying, really, I mean, any treatment, if it's a broad spectrum or if it's one of these more targeted things, you can leave uncut strips of alfalfa there and treat those areas with an insecticide or bait those strips, because grasshoppers, they like any type of tall grass or tall plants, and that's where they'll hang out. So you could leave uncut strips and then treat those areas so you avoid having to treat the entire field if it's really infested. And then the other thing too with these is you can treat that stubble after harvest. You really want to avoid the pre-harvest interval. You don't want to spray those plants and then harvest them shortly after. So just be aware of pre-harvest intervals with any of those products that you use. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is the army cutworm. There's a few different cutworms that I'll focus on, but this one is probably the most damaging and one that we see the most or really care about. With army cutworms, the larva here on the left, so that's kind of this dark brown color. They have these 3 light brown stripes on them, and then the light head capsule. And then on the right is what the moths look like. These ones are a little bit beat up, but you can see kind of like a boomerang shape there on the wing, on the lower wing there, on the one that's flipped upright. The other one's kind of upside down. But generally these guys, we refer to them as miller moths, but these are the army cutworm moths, and there's something that shows up. We see them in mass usually in the spring and the fall. So with army cutworms, again, like I said, they're present in spring and fall, and the larva will feed on the leaves, and they can eat the entire plant. So they'll look like almost like somebody just took a lawnmower into the field and buzzed off the plants, because they'll just leave them just a little bit of stubble there. They can really cause some issues. With the adult moths, I do some blacklight trapping for these every year. So this is our little blacklight trap out by the Sturgis Research Farm. And you can see, super high tech. I got like an ice cream bucket there that has all of my timer and everything inside of there. Unfortunately, we had a hailstorm that totally decimated that ice cream bucket. So it has since been upgraded to a little bit bigger bucket that can withstand some of the weather events that we get out west. But that blacklight trap, I set that up, right away in the spring to try to check for when those moths are going to be flying. I'll talk about kind of the life cycle of these here on the next slide. But with these guys, they're going to be coming out in really this, with the warm weather that we've had, they're probably going to be starting to get active already. When you have a cold snap like we just had, they're probably going to go dormant for a little bit, but those caterpillars, I'm sure, are hungry and looking for something to eat. So in terms of management, you can, scout for these guys by digging, holes in, just square foot holes in the ground, because they're going to be underground. The caterpillars are actually a nocturnal pest, so they're going to be showing up at night. They come out to feed. The threshold here for new stands, if you're digging and then kind of sift through the soil, if you find 2 caterpillars per square foot in new stands, and then it's 4 for established stands. And you can do tillage, flood irrigation, weed control, and then the in-furrow insecticides. But if you're applying an insecticide, try to do it again in the late afternoon or evening, because that's when those caterpillars are going to be coming out at night. So something to be aware of is those overnight low temperatures. So with that, if you have, I've had, plenty of guys in the past that have had issues that they go and they treat for these cutworms, and then they spray, and then they're like, well, they must be resistant because the insecticide didn't work. Well, you really have to pay attention to those overnight lows, because if it's above freezing, yeah, they're going to be coming out to feed. But if we have some days like we've had that were like 60 degrees and 40s for overnight lows, that's great. You could do a treatment then, but look in that forecast, and if you have where it's going to be dropping below freezing, you're going to have several nights there that those caterpillars aren't even going to be active. So you can treat on a really nice warm day, and then it gets cold and it's not really going to have any effect on them. So just be aware of that in the future. But with these guys too, just talking about their life cycle quickly, those moths, they're the caterpillars are going to be becoming active in the spring. They'll feed on some of those developing plants, and then they'll pupate, and then the moths are going to fly west into the Rocky Mountains. It's kind of interesting. They go up to the high elevations, and the bears will feed on them up there. But just like salmon returning to where they hatched from, these moths will fly back in the fall and then lay their eggs. They're going to be looking for, again, any of that weedy vegetation. That's why that's one of the management strategies there, or really just any of those green, hay fields and alfalfa fields are just prime real estate for these guys to set up shop. In the past, their flight pattern has been further south. They're more of an issue in, Kansas, into Colorado and stuff. But I've noticed just in the last, I've been doing this blacklight trapping for quite a while now, but just in the last, 3-4 years, it seems like their populations have increased in South Dakota. I think we had a couple years where we had some really strong winds out of the south that pushed their populations north a ways. And like I said, they'll always come back to where they spawned from. So it seems like we have a larger number of them that are migrating to and from South Dakota, that they just come right back. At least that's what I've been measuring here in terms of numbers for my trapping anyway. But it's kind of interesting how that maybe that pattern is starting to shift a little bit north than what we've had previously. So a couple other cutworms is the variegated cutworm. This one is more common later in the season. So with those army cutworms, you have that single generation that comes through, and then they leave. Those same moths will then come back and lay eggs. With these guys and the other one too, they'll have multiple generations here within a year. But very similar. They'll feed on the new leaves and can cut the plants there at the surface. And here's kind of what those caterpillars look like. A little bit different, obviously, than our army cutworms. Very similar management methods as well. Thresholds are very similar also. And you can use those insecticides as well. With these guys, and really any of those cutworms, if they're over 1.5 inches long, it's not recommended that you treat with an insecticide, because at that point they're large enough that they're going to be finished with their development anyway. And then dingy cutworm is the other one here. This is more of a light grayish brown cutworm, and very similar, that they'll show up a little bit later in the season, a couple generations at least there, and they can cut the plants as well. And similar management with these also. Okay, so for defoliators, just a couple other things with caterpillars that can cause defoliation. We have the alfalfa caterpillars and the green clover worms. There's what the larvae look like, and then here's the adults. So with the alfalfa caterpillars, there'll be these little butterflies, it can be yellow or white, and they'll have those black spots on the wings, as you can see. And then green clover worm's going to be more of this, brown, kind of triangular shaped moth. So with defoliators, and this kind of goes back to the alfalfa weevils too, it's kind of that overarching threshold there is about 30 to 40% defoliation. With caterpillars like these, generally there's enough natural enemies out there that feed on caterpillars that it keeps their populations down, and we often don't have to control, implement any type of management action with these because it's usually not necessary. But you can use an insecticide there for these, along with any of those other defoliation pests. Okay, so that was kind of the vast majority of those common alfalfa pests that we might see in an alfalfa field. I'm going to focus the rest of the time here on blister beetles. We'll talk a little bit on grasshoppers because they're closely related in terms of how they their life cycles, or how they kind of depend on one depends on the other. But I'm going to focus the rest of the time here mostly on these blister beetles. So this is what a typical blister beetle will look like. All of these species that we have here in South Dakota are about a half to an inch long, half inch to an inch long. Some of them might be a little bit smaller. There's some exceptions, but in general, they'll be in that size range. The color will be variable. Really depends on species. They're all going to have this velvety appearance, as you can see on this one here, kind of all these little hairs on the back. And some of the key features of a blister beetle, where how you can identify them, is that the thorax, first off, the thorax is going to be narrower than both the head and the abdomen. So it's almost like they have this little bit of a constriction there. So you can see that's pretty characteristic of these guys. And then the other thing is the abdomen will always stick out past the elytra. It's a lot more pronounced with the females. Will have a little bit bigger abdomen, and it's going to be sticking out. But you can see under the elytra, that's the hardened wings there on the top. You'll see the abdomen coming out the bottom. Okay, so with blister beetles, they're kind of an interesting insect. The adults are herbivores, so they're going to be feeding on. They really like flowers. They're going to be going on for pollen, and then they'll even feed on like the petals and things. They'll also feed on the leaves. You can see some here that look like they were kind of feeding on some alfalfa, but really the adults, in terms of feeding damage, it's not significant. Some of them can cause some issues in gardens, but for alfalfa fields, it's really not an issue. The other thing is the larva here on the flip side is that they're actually predatory. So the larvae are active below ground, and their primary food source is grasshopper eggs. So you think, well, that's actually kind of good. They're a beneficial insect because they'll feed on the grasshoppers and keep those populations down. And then they only have one generation per year. So we can see these blister beetles really throughout the growing season. And you think, well, maybe they have multiple generations, but it's not the case. It's each species will have one generation, but those species will show up at different times. So in this picture here, we have these ash gray ones. Those are usually the first ones that we see, and definitely the most common. So I just want to touch briefly on the life cycle of the blister beetles. So they will actually overwinter as this pseudo pupa, and then they'll complete their pupation in the spring. And then those adults will start emerging there in June and July. On a typical year, we really need to start watching for these guys around the 4th of July. That's usually when I start getting a lot of calls from people. However, like last year, they showed up a little bit earlier. It really depends on how quickly we get that spring warm up. This might be another case where we would see these guys showing up earlier than usual. just given how warm our temperatures have been as of late. And then they're going to be laying eggs in the late summer and early fall. Like I said, with that they feed on the grasshopper eggs. That's they're timing their egg laying right there when the grasshoppers are going to be laying their eggs, or maybe a little bit before. So if they lay their eggs there in late summer, grasshoppers are going to be doing that more in the fall. Uh, by the time those blister beetle eggs hatch out, those larvae are going to be active and ready to go just as soon as those grasshoppers are dropping eggs into the soil. Okay, so you think, well, they're predatory as larvae. They feed on grasshoppers. That's awesome. So why are they actually an issue? Well, this is the reason for this is that they have something called cantharidin. It's a chemical that's in their blood, and cantharidin is actually quite poisonous. So with cantharidin, it's going to cause blistering. If you touch these with your bare skin, as you can see in this picture here, this was one of my coworkers that took one for the team there and got one of these things on his hand and kind of made it mad, and it ended up causing a blister there. But I've seen definitely some more severe cases when people have these things drop down their shirt or something, and they're like back there smacking at it, or they crush it, and then they can have all these big, blisters showing up on their neck and back. It's quite a nuisance that way. But this cantharidin, they release it when they feel threatened. They do something that we call reactive bleeding it's some insects do. It's kind of a wild thing, but they'll actually secrete that chemical. And then it obviously tastes pretty bad and can cause blistering. So if you try to pick one of these guys up, definitely wear gloves. Don't do it with your bare hand, or you might end up getting some blisters. So the other way that cantharidin can be released, like I mentioned, is that they can be crushed. So it can happen when you're, smacking a beetle on your arm or something. But it can also happen when an animal is consuming infested hay and they're chewing that hay up with their teeth, and they crush up those beetles, and then that releases that cantharidin. So it's really an issue here when livestock will ingest a lot of these beetles, and it can cause internal blistering, and really just be quite toxic to those animals. So with cattle, it's not nearly as much of a concern. It could certainly, if they ate a lot of these, they could certainly get sick, and might reduce their appetite. But we haven't had any cases of livestock or of like cattle actually dying from eating blister beetles. Sheep and goats, they're usually pretty picky eaters, at least in my experience. With like a cow, if they get a nail or a wire or something in the hay, it all goes to the same place. But sheep will certainly kind of feel everything out. If they taste one of these blister beetles, it tastes kind of bitter, they'll generally spit them out. We typically don't have issues with these being toxic to sheep too bad. But horses are the ones that are particularly sensitive to that cantharidin. And those are the ones that we really need to watch for, is when we're feeding alfalfa or potentially infested alfalfa to horses. So if you remember, this was back in 2020. It kind of got buried by all of the COVID news that showed up later that year. But this one incident really made national headlines. Was when we had it was a horse ranch in Wisconsin that they purchased some infested hay off of. It was actually a hay auction. I think they got it from Belfouche. And it was like a whole thing of like, well, these blister beetles came from South Dakota. Well, it turns out that the hay bales actually came from Texas. They do have some more issues with blister beetles the further south you go, that they have some that are a bit more toxic or have those higher cantharidin levels in them. So it ended up that they came from Texas, but it was still a wake up call for everybody in South Dakota of like, hey, okay, we have blister beetles, they're an issue, something what we definitely need to watch for. But it was kind of a yeah, tragic situation there that they had 14 horses died and a lot of them got sick. And yeah, it was really the last time here that those blister beetles really made the news big time, was in that case. So just talking about toxicity in general with blister beetles, there's been some research on this. It's estimated that it's 1 milligram of that cantharidin per 2.2 pounds for horses is the lethal concentration for that. Again, this is only for horses. So for other animals, for cattle, it'd probably be quite a bit higher, but it kind of depends. Where horses again are the main concern with this. And you can figure, depending on the species, you can have 1 to 5 milligrams of this cantharidin per beetle. At least that's the ones that we have here in South Dakota. And among those that are of the biggest concern are the striped, spotted, and ash gray blister beetles. So you can see kind of a rundown here on average what how much they contain. So the stripe there more on that 5 milligrams, spotted is 2, and then the ash gray are further down at 1. The other species that we have here in the state are going to be less than 1 milligram per beetle. And in general, I think it seems like the males have a higher concentration of that cantharidin than the females do. The males are going to be, same species, but they're just slightly smaller size. The females will be a little bit bigger. So to put this into perspective, what it might look like here for, we'll say, a typical horse around 1,000 pounds, how many of these beetles that they'd actually have to consume before it could cause mortality. So with the black blister beetles, these ones have, again, that less than a milligram, not a huge, big concentration. A horse would have to eat over 2,000 of those black blister beetles in order for it to be fatal. Spotted blister beetles, they have a little higher concentration, so they'd only need to eat, a little less than 700 of them to be to get. I mean, if they ate some of these, they could get sick, but this is for actually to be fatal to that animal. And then the 3-striped blister beetle is the most toxic that we have here in the state, and those, yeah, you'd only need about 160 of them to cause death. So as I said, they can certainly get sick from eating any quantity of these things, but this is when you'd have so many that they would actually cause the death of that animal. So some other things that I've gotten questions about, people wanting to try to test feed or different things for the cantharidin levels or testing for blister beetles. To my knowledge, there's just a couple universities here that will actually do tests for that cantharidin, that blister beetle toxin. So one is at NDSU, and then the other is Texas A&M will do that as well. And at least I know at NDSU, they'll test like blood plasma and urine samples. If you wanted to test an animal just to see what concentration of cantharidin that they have in their system. Texas A&M, they'll actually take manure and feed samples as well, along with your urine and blood samples. So if it's something that you're concerned about, you think that you had a horse that may have gotten into some infested hay and something that you wanted to check, you can send in samples to get them checked. Most of these run about $50 is the general fee there for getting any of these things tested. So I wanted to talk about the common species that we have here in South Dakota, which ones that you can see kind of help with identification when you're out in the field. So the common species we have, this is listed in order of like most common to what we have and then least common. So the ash gray, we see these, every year. They're the ones that show up first and we see them all over the place. And then the black blister beetle, that's also a very common species, but it shows up usually right after the ash gray. So you'll see those ash gray ones showing up in, maybe June, July, and then those black blister beetles really start ramping up in, further into July and August. We'll also have the immaculate blister beetles, the striped blister beetles, the margined blister beetle, and the spotted ones. And I'm going to go through each of these individually, show a picture, and so you can get an idea what they look like. So I've been showing several pictures of these ash gray blister beetles. They're going to be that less than an inch long, 2/5 to 2/3 of an inch, and they're going to be black, and then they'll have these kind of these, well, mostly light gray, and then they'll have some of these black highlights on them, as you can see in this picture. Black blister beetles, as the name implies, they're going to be solid, just a jet black, usually a little bit shinier than some of these other ones. They have more of a velvety appearance. The black blister beetles can be a little bit shinier, and very similar in size to the ash gray, maybe a little bit smaller generally, but right in that same size range. The immaculate blister beetle. So this is one that they have a couple different color forms. They can be really big. They're among the largest of the blister beetles that we have. So these are usually 1/2 to an inch long there. But they can be gray or they can be this kind of orange color. And I often see these on sunflowers. They show up later in the season, and it's right about around when the sunflowers are blooming, so they're attracted to those blossoms there, and that's where they head right to the flowers and feed on the pollen and stuff. But not a significant pest, and it's better off that they're in a sunflower field than your alfalfa, if you ask me. But that's definitely one that you might see showing up from time to time. The striped blister beetles, these are, again, those most toxic ones that we have here in the state. And, that coloration is kind of indicative of that, because they have almost that bright warning coloration with the black and yellowish orange stripes down them, kind of warning everybody like, hey, I taste bad and can kill you, so don't touch me. So these ones are a little bit smaller again than those immaculate ones, about 2/5 to 2/3 of an inch long. They'll have these triangular markings on the head, as you can see. It's almost like two triangles kind of pointed away from each other. And then they'll have those two black stripes on the thorax, and then again the 2 to 3 there on the elytra. The next one here is the margined blister beetle. These ones and the striped ones too, they show up typically more East River. I really have rarely seen many of those striped ones west of the river. I know we did have a case of those in Jackson County, though. I think that was a year or two ago. So they can get this far west, but it's more further east that they're more prevalent. The margin blister beetle, this one has different color forms. They can be gray, black, or then black with the white margins, like you can see on this guy. So they're also going to have a black and white head. And then these ones are a pretty bad pest for gardens. They can really cause a lot of defoliation in a short amount of time. So if you're a gardener, you might need to watch out for these guys. But in terms of alfalfa production, they might not be as abundant or as big of an issue as some of these other ones. Again, pretty low cantharidin levels with these guys as well. The spotted blister beetle, this is one that I wasn't sure if we had it in the state. I mean, they have it in neighboring states, and I wasn't surprised when we found this one just last year. but this is kind of that next level down from the striped ones. These have that 2 milligrams of cantharidin. So they're somewhat toxic, but at least it doesn't seem that we have a lot of them. They're the rarest of the blister beetles that we see, and they're also really small. So these ones are only about a third to a half of an inch long. They're going to have a black body and then white hair on them, and then some of these spots you can see how they get their spotted, the name as a spotted blister beetle, because they have some of these black spots that show through on the hairs, or thinner patches of hair. So we actually were doing, this was part of a different research project, doing some sweep netting, and we went to about every county in the state, and I did find one of these guys up in Perkins County just last year. So we do have them. They're more of an issue. I know they're more common up in Montana, so it really wasn't surprising that I found one there in the northwest part of the state. But yeah, they can be around, and another one that we can certainly watch for. There's the one that I captured there, and he's already been pinned and cataloged. So yeah, you can see that's certainly what it is. So for general scouting for these blister beetles, you want to check fields for these beetles prior to each cutting. It's more of an issue there for the second and later cuttings, but we like last year that we had some of these showing up at the first cutting. So it really depends on how quickly you have that spring green up as to when these guys are gonna show up. And a general rule here is that we'll usually see those blister beetles showing up more abundant in those places where grasshoppers were high in numbers the previous year. So again, you have more of those grasshoppers are going to be laying eggs, more of a food source, and then you're going to have more blister beetles in turn. So with that, I wanted to talk about grasshoppers just briefly, like what kind of gears or propels those blister beetle populations year to year. So you really have to look at those grasshopper numbers. So one of the things that is a driver for our grasshopper numbers is those dry conditions. So if we look at drought conditions last year, this was June 20th. I think this was kind of the worst drought map that we had, or at the largest extent there that we had on both sides of the river here. As we got later in the season, I think we got some relief here in the west, and it got a little bit worse there to the east. So they had more of a grasshopper issue East River. And that's something, if your East River, might be a potential year to have more blister beetles than you've had in the past, just because those grasshopper numbers were pretty high last year. So one thing, definitely those dry conditions, grasshoppers do well. You don't have those fungal pathogens that will naturally occur and bring those populations down. So if you were dry, you had a lot of grasshoppers, might have some blister beetle issues next year. Or if you had them last year, you'll have them this year. The other thing that we need to look at is the first freeze dates. So this is another driver for those grasshopper numbers, or really the blister beetle numbers. So it depends on the later you have that first freeze, or that 28 degrees, when all your insect activity really drops off. If you have a later freeze, it's going to allow more time for those grasshoppers to be hanging out, laying eggs well into the fall. If you have an early freeze, that really cuts them off early, and they're not able to lay as many eggs. So if we look back in the past, 2021, we had pretty widespread late freezes there. We were well into October's and into November in some places. And it wasn't a surprise that 2022 was a pretty wild grasshopper year. There were pretty widespread, abundant populations throughout the state, really. 2023 was a little bit patchier, and that kind of corresponds too with our frost date there, or freeze date. We had a little bit earlier freeze there in 2022, but there was some patchiness. You can see kind of West River, we had some issues, but it really kind of depends on both your freeze dates and again with your with those dry conditions. So looking at 2023 and what we can expect here for 2024, it was kind of a mixed bag here for our first freeze dates, a little bit later than what we had in 2022, but yeah, it kind of gives you an idea if you're in one of those places that you did have a later freeze, those grasshoppers were laying eggs later in the season, you might be having some blister beetle issues this coming year. So what to expect in 2024? Again, like I said, late freeze means a long time for those grasshoppers to lay eggs. We did not have any issues like this. This was in 2021 where we had drought conditions followed by that late freeze. And we had, I think this was up in Butte County. They had, this was just in a pasture that you had areas of bare ground, prime real estate for grasshoppers to lay eggs. And they just went absolutely nuts. It wasn't quite as bad, obviously. This last year we had quite a bit more moisture, West River, that you didn't have the bare ground and it wasn't quite as favorable. But this is kind of a worst case scenario back from 2021. Again, if you have a lot of those eggs, that means that you're going to have an abundant food source for those blister beetles. And as I mentioned, they could be elevated in some of those areas where you had grasshopper issues last year. So some more scouting tips. Again, I keep pushing the sweep nets. Excellent scouting tool, because even if you look out in the field and you don't, a lot of these insects can just drop from the plants and you might not even see them. If you come out there with a sweep net, you'll catch a lot of things that you never even thought were in the field, just looking at it with the naked eye. So again, doing the visual observations, use a sweep net. There are no established thresholds for blister beetles. It's more of a presence or absence thing in terms of, how you need to go about managing them there. And it's more of determining what species are present. So, if you got some striped blister beetles, that's much bigger concern than if you have some of those ash gray that aren't quite as toxic. And then the other thing too is checking different areas in the field. With blister beetles, there are usually kind of a edge effects with these guys, that if your alfalfa is blooming or something, they'll come into the edge of the field, and then towards the middle it might not be so bad. Okay, so let's talk management here to finish up. So with blister beetles, if you can harvest prior to peak bloom, because those blossoms, that's just like a magnet for these guys. I think that was in 2022, I think, following those, when we had the grasshopper numbers, lots of blister beetles showing up. And I had a guy out by, I think that was also up in Butte County, that a lot of his neighbors had already cut their I think it was the first cutting there of alfalfa, or I think it was the second cutting actually. That they had already cut their alfalfa, and then this guy had kind of gotten a little bit behind, and his field was just in peak bloom, and it was like all the blister beetles came from the neighbors and they went right into his field. So it was a worst case scenario. It was just thick with these guys. But I'll tell you, the main thing with these, you don't want to spray them with an insecticide. It's going to make things worse because you don't want to kill them. You want them to try to get them to leave the plants, or like leave the windrows. So I went out there, you could see when they were actively cutting it, there were blister beetles all over the cutter bar, and they were just thick. But we went back to some windrows that they had cut, a couple hours before, and you could see the blister beetles. They were, the hay was drying down. The blister beetles were working their way up to the tops of those windrows and flying away. So that's the huge thing, is that you want the hay to dry fully before you go and rake it up. Just keep monitoring those windrows. If you have a lot of blister beetles, check them and just make sure that a lot of those blister beetles will vacate those plants before you go and bale it up. The other thing is when you cut the hay, try not to use, if you can avoid using a conditioner, don't crimp or crush the hay, or at least try to take as much pressure off as you can, because you don't want to smash those beetles and get that cantharidin, coating the hay as well. That can be bad. Um, so again, cut it, let it dry, let the beetles leave the windrows, and don't spray the infested fields. That's the worst thing you can do, because then those beetles are just gonna, their legs are gonna crunch up, and then they're just gonna hold on to those stems, and even a dead beetle is still gonna have that cantharidin inside of them. Just some considerations here for buying and selling hay. So you want to notify a buyer there if the bales are infested. Certainly if they're using it for horses. If you can, try to use first cutting to feed to horses, just because you're going to have, that's kind of your insurance policy that you're not going to have those blister beetles or nearly the numbers that you'd have in later cuttings. And then also you want to try to avoid feeding hay from the field edges there, to horses at least, because that's where you're going to have those higher numbers usually, if you have that edge effect. So just a quick summary here on the blister beetles. They could be abundant in some areas in 2024. Just kind of depends on what your grasshopper numbers were like last year. Scout alfalfa there prior to each cutting with the warm spring temperatures here that we're already experiencing. I would do that even before the first cutting. I'd already be looking for these guys. Know what species are present. Again, the striped, spotted, and ash gray are a bit more toxic, but mostly those striped and spotted ones are the ones we were most worried about. Avoid conditioning infested hay, and then again, allow it to dry fully before raking and baling. And then the other thing too is just be careful when buying and selling, especially for horses, that you want to make sure that that hay is not infested.
I did put up the QR code here, but what other questions do you have out there? Here's one: besides selling, how do you feed infested hay to sheep? Probably
Um,
talking blister beetles, I'm guessing.
I would imagine so. So with sheep, or really with any, even with cattle and stuff, is usually when I get that question. I would, if you have infested hay, try, like, if you can, if you're doing, well, it's more for cattle and stuff. If you're doing like bale grazing, if you can try to dilute it, basically, that you'd have, if you had an infested bale, but then you'd have ones that that aren't infested. Um, that's one thing. Is just trying to spread it out, or to try to dilute the amount of blister beetles that those animals might consume. That would be the best thing that I could say to do. Otherwise, that's, at least then you could use those hay bales. The other thing is maybe letting those infested ones sit for a while. I know the half-life, at least in like, I think I was reading a study where they checked like blood serum, or plasma there in dogs actually, and they found like the half-life of this cantharidin was about roughly like 40 minutes to an hour. So it's something where, I mean, obviously if it's inside of a beetle, it might last a little bit longer if they're not crushed. But it might be something where you let those bales sit for a while and let the cantharidin levels kind of diminish, before you feed it. But yeah, my other thing is just feeding it with hay bales that aren't infested, so you're trying to dilute it as much as possible.
And we've had the question before, Pat, where someone's like feeding hay with a fork, for example, and wondering, are they able to get the insects out of the hay? And that's pretty tough. I mean, unless you're like finely sifting through, I don't know if
Yeah,
that's something you can do.
yeah, it is kind of tough, because when the beetles die, their legs, like I said, their legs kind of all curl up, and then they'll really attach themselves to the stems. But like I said before, with sheep, at least my experience, they're picky eaters, and if they get something that tastes weird, they'll spit it out. So it might be something with sheep that they're not even going to eat them to begin with. They'll kind of sift through and spit the beetles out. Obviously, I can't say that 100% guaranteed, but they're not like cattle where whatever goes in the mouth just goes straight down, and that's just the way it is. Sheep are kind of picky that way, and maybe that's a good thing.
Any other questions for Pat? Okay, I don't see anything. You can always email Pat or myself, and we'll make sure that that question gets to the right person. But thanks for joining us today. Tomorrow on Crop Hour, we're going to have Jeff Jackson. He's actually with Cropland. He's going to talk about alternative forages. He's the forage fanatic, if you know him that way. So hopefully we can see you tomorrow, and thanks for tuning in today. Oh, I will hold off. We have one more question. So if hay is stored until winter, the toxicity is gone, but the bad flavor could still be there.
So like with yeah, if you're feeding to sheep potentially, um, but yeah, I'm not sure if like how how long the flavor is going to persist or something. I'm assuming it's like if you're concerned that like the sheep wouldn't eat it or something, wouldn't eat the hay if it's got it on it. Um, I'd imagine that that's going to diminish over time. So I mean, once your cantharidin levels are going to drop, I would imagine that flavor is going to drop as well too. But I guess I can't I can't say that for sure. But definitely a good question there. I don't think I'd be too concerned about that.
Yeah, I guess they'll tell you if it's palatable, right?
Yeah, if the sheep don't eat it, I guess it's not palatable.
Then nobody's going to eat it. Maybe a goat.
Maybe a cow.
So, Pat, for all the people with the horse questions, the cantharidin half-life is interesting. So, does that mean that if they let their hay sit till winter, it could potentially be safe for horses, or is that just such a sensitive level that you wouldn't want to take the risk?
I think it's something where maybe you take advantage of if you had hay that you knew it was infested, take advantage of some of those labs that will do cantharidin testing. If you could send in a feed like a hay sample, just to see what the levels are. If you let them sit for a year. Um, but yeah, it's that half life that's really going to depend on where it's at. Again, there's not much. The only evidence I could find of that again was when they were testing that it was in dogs, I guess, to check the blood. But that's another thing that you can certainly test the animals just to see what the levels are in their system. And if they have pretty elevated levels, well, maybe you should try to feed them some hay that you know is clean until it kind of backs off a little bit or those levels drop.
Interesting stuff,
Yeah.
for sure. Well, thanks, Pat, and thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, everybody.